Thanks. So thank you for having me down to Australia. And I think when Bertil and Vidar saw me present this, it was right after lunch, and I must have kept them awake because now they've put me right after lunch again. So I have to put on a show to keep everyone awake now. This is joint work with Gautam Gowrisankaran, who unfortunately has decamped from Arizona to Colombia to the frigid north. And Wendan Zhang, who was a graduate student of mine at Arizona, and this grew out of her dissertation. Okay, so we're thinking in this paper about policy uncertainty, and we think that uncertainty over things like government policy affect important and irreversible decisions, such as technology adoption, entry, exit, all those things we care about in dynamic models. The process of forming and implementing policies often creates uncertainty. So in the US, but also elsewhere, legislation is passed by, say, Congress, and then the Environmental Protection Agency or some other agency has to figure out what the actual rules on the ground are and the enforcement mechanisms. This is nice because you can have infrequent legislation that then can react to technological change or things like that over time. The drawback of it is that because it's not legislatively passed, it's often, these rules and regulations are often subject to a lot of court challenges, up to and including the Supreme Court. And for the Environmental Protection Agency in the US, these regulations are often struck down. So we very frequently have policies that just get completely wiped. So we want to think about the costs of policy uncertainty. We think these costs probably depend on at least three big things that we're going to care about here. The first is the extent to which compliance requires irreversible decisions. So obviously, if you can costlessly and immediately respond to any changing circumstances, maybe uncertainty won't be such a big deal. But for things like investment or exit, these decisions require considering option value, and maintaining option value can increase compliance costs. Beyond that, there's also, of course, the fact that maintaining option value could change externalities. So if the costs of policy uncertainty affect exit of coal-fired power plants or something like that, then that can affect how much coal is burned and how much CO2 is released into the air, for instance. And then the last is this interesting point that we won't touch on too much here, but it's whether the policy is eventually enforced. So in the United States, the Waxman-Markey bill was the closest we ever came to having a carbon price. And I have a different co-author from Arizona, Derek Lemoyne, who shows that even the discussions surrounding Waxman-Markey led to increased coal extraction. So there was concern that this would be more expensive in the future, lower profits in the future, and so people started pulling more coal out of the ground. So we think this is something to be interested. We find this interesting and important in a lot of contexts. Telecommunications, healthcare, finance, all have these same types of things. Obviously, today I'm going to talk about environmental policy. Okay, so what are we doing in this paper? We're going to literally estimate uncertainty. We're going to estimate beliefs about the likelihood of mercury and air toxic standard being enforced. This is a particular legislation, or sorry, a particular rule in the United States. It regulated emissions from electricity generation. And we're going to model generators' exit and abatement technology adoption decisions, which is how they comply with MATS. Then, once we have our estimated model, we're going to simulate how policy uncertainty affects counterfactual outcomes in industry. In particular, we want to know how changing policy uncertainty affects pollution, exit, and compliance costs. So the way to just think about this at a high level early on is a policy is announced, you have some time before potential enforcement. The potential enforcement date comes around and a coin is flipped. And if the coin comes up heads, you have to comply. If it comes up tails, you don't. All we're going to think about is, okay, if we know the weights on head versus tails, let's flip the coin at the announcement date. Change nothing else. So we're going to leave the level of the policy the same, but try to collapse the spread of uncertainty, have a mean preserving spread. Of course, doing all of this is going to require estimating a dynamic equilibrium model. We're going to come up with a somewhat new way of estimating generators, a very new way of estimating generators' beliefs about policy uncertainty. And we're going to have some new approaches to thinking about dynamic equilibrium counterfactuals to quantify the impacts of uncertainty. Okay, a little background on MATS. So coal-fired generator power plants are the primary emitters of air toxics from electricity generation. Air toxics are bad. They are very bad for you. Birth defects, cancer, serious illnesses. Don't go breathing in stuff coming out of a coal power plant. Despite those dangers, in the United States, federal regulation has been recent and highly uncertain. EPA releases the final MATS rule in 2012 and announces it'll be enforced in 2016. They give them 4 years to comply. The regulation has been subject to substantial judicial and administrative review up to and including the Supreme Court. While the federal government was going through this whole process of figuring out how to regulate air toxics, some US states took it upon themselves to enforce similar regulations within their own boundaries. And the key here is that at the state level, these things actually passed the legislature generally. Some of them were actually worked out as rules with the input from the local electricity generators. In either case, they're incredibly certain. Once these things actually pass or get enacted, we could only find one court case against one of these policies that had actually become enacted, and it was thrown out at the first hearing by the judge as being ridiculous. Okay, so it's very certain that those will actually be enforced. So you can sort of see where we're going to get identification here. We're going to compare the policies, compare the actions of the generators at the state, under the states that have state policies, to those generators that are under the federal policy. So we're estimating this dynamic oligopoly model between 2006 and 17. We focus on independent power producers, that's what we call the generators in the United States who are subject to market forces. We're not looking at regulated electricity utilities. That's actually a separate paper with separate issues. Every year, generators subject to MATS wake up on January 1st, form beliefs about the 2016 enforcement probability. So they could be sitting in 2012 or 2013. They're forming a belief about having to comply in 2016. They all then simultaneously decide whether to adopt abatement technology, exit, or continue without the technology. They earn operating profits by supplying electricity to hourly markets within the year. And then maybe the fourth step that should be up there is all of those decisions about adoption, exit, or continue are realized at the end of the year. Okay, so equilibrium effects matter here. And in particular, one generator's exit is going to increase rivals' profits, decreasing their likelihood of exit, right? So if Bertil and I are 2 coal power plants and I exit, he's happy about that. That makes him more likely to stay in because it likely increases his profits going forward. This leads to some standard sort of strategic games. In particular, we're thinking about adopting the potential that I would adopt abatement technology to signal to Bertil that I'm not leaving, you better take off, right? So this preemption motive follows things like Schmidt-Dengler's job market paper. Okay, so the generators are now going to compete in a Markov equilibrium. We're building on the concepts of moment-based Markov equilibrium from Ifrak and Weintraub. In that model, each player has to be categorized as either fringe or dominant. And then the players keep track of individual dominant players' states, and then some aggregate market description of what's going on in the fringe. In our approach, we're going to take things slightly differently. We're going to say that all generators know that their actions affect a broader market state. But I don't care who I'm competing against as long as I know that I'm competing against X megawatts of coal capacity, something like that. Okay. So we're going to have aggregate states that are coal capacity as a fraction of load, technology adoption share, and fuel prices. These are going to be aggregate states that everybody thinks affects their own profits into the future. They understand that they can potentially affect coal capacity and technology adoption. Fuel prices are going to evolve exogenously. The limitation right up front is in the current paper. We're not modeling ownership linkages across generators. So, we think that this is okay. The states are relatively unconcentrated, but fundamentally, we're not modeling the fact that one firm might own multiple generators. Okay, so identification. We use the difference between generators' responses to state air toxic standards and MATS to identify this perceived probability of enforcement. In general, it may be hard to identify the MATS probabilities. If you see a generator not exiting the market, it could be because they think there's no chance they're going to have to comply with this silly thing, and so why would they bother? Or it could be that they have really high exit costs, right? And so those two things are very hard to pull apart. But we're going to make use of this fact that we see the behaviors of the plants in the state policy states where we are assuming that the probability is 1 of enforcement. Let me show you a picture for this. So in this picture, we're putting everything in event time. Compliance is in zero, enforcement is in year 0. 1 year before is your last chance to comply. And the green dotted line are the share of firms that will eventually adopt the abatement technology in the state policy states. And then the orange line with triangles is for the federal policy. And you see that starting sort of 5 years back, we've just normalized. In the 4 years before, it's actually not so different between the two, but they really spread apart, right? 3 years before and really 2 years before, there's just this huge lag building up in how the generators subject to MATs are responding relative to the generators subject to the state policies. And that's what we're after. This is completely unconditional, by the way. So, obviously we're gonna have a full model to actually estimate probabilities. This is just giving you a feel for the identification. Okay, so along the way on all this, we're gonna need to get annual profits of the generators. Annual profits are gonna be revenues from electricity sales net of 3 costs. Fuel costs, that's easy to recover in electricity because we observe heat rates, which is how much fuel you burn per unit you produce, and we observe fuel prices. Ramping costs, it takes a lot of energy to get these big, they're basically giant pieces of concrete with machines inside warmed up, right, to actually generate enough power. And so you're going to spend a whole bunch of effort and fuel and everything else to change your production. And we need to keep track of that. And then operations and maintenance costs, things like labor. The ramping costs in particular, we're worried about in our context. Why? Well, potentially the costs are substantial. Mara Rigwant and Josh Lin and co-author sort of suggest that. But more importantly, in our context, or at least as importantly, fracking lowers natural gas prices hugely in America in the middle of our period. And so that's going to completely change the ramping costs that generators face. Let me show you some quick evidence on that. So once a coal power plant gets up to sort of its maximum capacity, it stays there for about 28 hours in 2006. But that number falls substantially over time in a way that very much tracks the ratio of gas to coal price. That's up at 4.6 and falls off a cliff in 2009 down to 2.3 and continues to fall. So per unit of energy, gas just gets crazy cheap halfway through our sample, a little before halfway through our sample. And this is going to be super important because it's really changing how many ramps occur and how long the units stay at full generation. Okay, so we're going to have to get estimates of ramping and O&M costs. 45 minutes is a little short for this paper because there's 2 dynamic models, one nested inside another. So I'm probably where I'm going to cut time a little bit is more on this hourly model, but let me give you a sense of it. We develop a conceptual experiment that compares 2 sets of hours with similar future prices, but where the generation varied in the previous hour. So again, coming back to our 2 coal plants, let's say I was running at sort of minimum generation last hour, Bertle was off. We both find ourselves in this position where like future electricity prices look very similar to both of us. The probability that I go up to full generation relative to Bertle's tells me something about his extra cost. I think he was the one who was off, his extra cost of ramping relative to mine. So we're going to use all of these sort of changes. The nice thing here is that this is going to give us the ability to solve the hourly model with an incredibly simple single line of stata code. Okay, so we're not going to need to solve that 8760-hour dynamic Bellman, which would be a giant pain, right? Okay, so we're going to use generators observed actions. So the limitation here, I should say, is we are going to assume price taking in just to estimate those ramping costs and O&M costs. Once we have those costs, we'll take the generator's actual actions to calculate profit. So those actual actions could include all sorts of market power issues. Okay. 3 main literatures that we think we're building on, sort of a wide-ranging measurement of economic and policy uncertainty literature that Derek Lemoyne and I have an incredibly different paper in that thinks about measuring uncertainty. Difference here is we're going to recover beliefs and perform counterfactuals. That we have not seen a paper do that. Structural estimation of electricity industry. So this is obviously a growing literature. The one I'll point out is the Gowrisankaran, Langer, and Reguant paper, which is a model of regulated electricity utilities in energy transitions. So that's different from this one because that's regulation. This is about uncertainty, air toxics in the sort of deregulated, restructured markets. And then finally, we're building on MME from Ifrak and Weintraub, which builds on oblivious equilibrium. For those of you at the summer camp, I'll talk more about these in detail tomorrow. But these MME applications have become increasingly popular in environmental and energy economics in particular. Okay, all three of those sites are energy broadly defined. Okay, so let me give you a little bit more background. EPA regulates air toxics under the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. That's the last legislation, right? So that gives you a real sense of like how much the EPA does in this interim to figure out what the rules should actually be. The initial rule for, I shouldn't say for electricity, the initial air toxics rule for electricity was announced in 2005, but struck down by the Supreme Court in 2008. So this is a prime example of this happens all the time. The courts required a stricter standard for a wider set of pollutants. So they had to go back to the drawing board and come up with a new policy to regulate mercury and air toxics. This new rule, MATS, was again challenged up to the Supreme Court. The executive branch, of course, as we know, changes in the early 2017. That completely changes the motivation, direction, everything of the EPA. Despite all of that, MATS did become the rule of law. So in 2006, the Supreme Court left it in place, sent it back to the EPA for more justification, but because they left it in place, it became the law in 2016. Beyond uncertainty, there are some differences between the US state regulations and MATS that I want to point out because we'll need to think about how to model them. Compliance and enforcement is sometimes less stringent than MATS. So sometimes they're allowed to emit a little bit more pollutants. Sometimes they just need to sort of show a receipt for the technology and say, yeah, it's up there, instead of actually showing that it's working and running and all of those things. And then US states mostly just regulated mercury rather than all air toxics. That ends up being less critically important because the technology to control them is quite closely related. And then the other pollution regulation that's floating around at the time, you might be concerned, well, what else was changing over this period? The other one was the cross-state air pollution rule. You could comply with that by buying permits that were incredibly cheap. So you should think of those as just like a small underlying cost of doing business. Okay. We use 8 different data sets. These are all publicly available. You can just go download any of these, all of them. So I won't go through in detail. The slides are up, but for the grad students in the room, this is a treasure trove. It's also a pain in the neck to pull together, but it's a treasure trove. Here are the states that have state policies. So they are, we're going to look at the eastern interconnection of the US. So you should think of this as like North Dakota and East, kind of. Excluding Texas. So, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Illinois, Delaware, Maryland, Minnesota, Wisconsin, they're a bit spread out all over the place, and they have different timelines. The most important thing I'll point out is that all of these passed before MATS was announced, and all except for Wisconsin were enforced before MATS was even announced. So we're going to need to worry about the different timing of what's going on in the different states and different fuel prices and things like that. Okay, so we're going to have 2 main analysis data sets. The first is thinking about the adoption and exit decisions. Those are coming from generator year level data. And then the second is that hourly level data to get at the ramping costs and the O&M costs. I keep talking about generators. Generators, you should think of it as like a thing that burns fuel, not a power plant. A power plant could have more than one of these at the plant. But we're focusing on the generator level because this is the level at which you make decisions. You frequently see a power plant shut down one, but not the other generator. As I said, we're looking at the Eastern interconnection, and we're looking at these generators that are subject to market prices, that sell their electricity out into the market. Okay, so the key variable that we have to pull out of the data is going to be when generators install abatement technology. To do this, we actually follow something very close to what the EPA does. We see effectively instantaneous pollution. You can get pollution at a very fine level here. And you see it sort of bounces around and then it drops and it bounces around. It's very clear when they install technology in these data. Okay. I feel like I have to tell the joke here because I was raised by reduced form labor economists, and yet, so I feel the need to show a balance table, but I'm an IO economist, so it's not the best balance table in the whole world, okay? So, you know, be okay with me here. Those units subject to state policy are a little bit bigger than the ones subject to MATS, but notice that the variation within each category just completely swamps any difference in means. The one place where we do, interestingly enough, see some differences is states with higher coal fuel prices were actually less likely to pass these regulations on coal plants. I don't have any great intuition on why, but there's a statistical difference there, and it feeds into the marginal fuel costs. But of course, all of that's going to be taken care of in our model. Okay. Let me just mostly point out here, this is again an event time. And what we're looking at here is just, I'll point out, because the state policy regulations were in this earlier time period when natural gas prices were still high, we see a lot of adoption in the states for state policy when those things, in order to comply, a lot of units subject to state policy adopt the technology, whereas those subject to MATS exit the market. Remember, MATS is happening in 2012 through 16. Natural gas prices fell off a cliff in 2009. These plants are generally quite old, and you're sort of in this moment where they're holding on for dear life, losing money, hoping that maybe natural gas prices come back up, and this gives them the incentive to just quit. That's at least one story. Okay, but we do see some adoptions even in MATS. All right, so here's the model. Infinite horizon, dynamic equilibrium model of adoption, exit, and production. We're focused on a market, which we're defining as a US state. And each year, generators operate and earn profits. Each generator is endowed with some heat rate and capacity. That tells you how expensive it is for you to burn fuel, basically, generate electricity. And each year T, we have an indicator for whether you've already installed. We'll call that tech. Generators compete, as I've said, in this dynamic oligopoly. They're competing with other coal, but also gas, renewables, non-IPP coal, and other sources. There's a little bit of fuel oil and things like that. We're going to treat those sources' decisions as exogenous, but state contingent and time varying. So they can respond to the fact that MATS is coming, right? They realize that a bunch of coal generators are likely to exit, and you could have entry of natural gas. In fact, we think that's largely how load is being met in this period. Totally fine. Generators are going to expect that given what fuel prices are and the probability of MATS. Okay, so more detail on the timing of this. In some year, beginning of the year, you form your beliefs. Some year, the regulator just drops out of the sky and announces that there's going to be an air toxic standard tau naught years in the future. In some states, that's 8. For the federal, it's 4. Before that period, they don't expect to be subject to any air toxics regulations, so simplifying assumption. And in years between the announcement and the enforcement, the generators are going to have an enforcement probability belief p-tau. So that'll change every year. At that moment, they believe that that p-tau will continue into the future. So if I'm sitting in 2013, p-tau doesn't actually really affect any of my current profits or anything like that, except through the fact that I think in a few years, I may be forced from the market if I haven't adopted. And so will some of my rivals, right? So that's how I'm thinking about this. And so I need to think about my Bellman like 3 periods out is affected by p-tau. They make adoption and exit decisions that have EV1 standard errors, as we would all assume. They pay an adoption cost, exit scrap value, and then get a continuation draw. They compete in those hourly electricity markets. What we're going to do is basically calculate profits for every generator that we observe, and then fit a profit surface across the state so that we can predict profits given the market state. And that's what they're going to believe their profits would be if they landed in that state in the future. And then finally, the adoption and exit decisions are implemented. In the final year before enforcement, the regulator then is going to enforce with probability P1, that last probability. So at the end of the year, if you haven't adopted, and the government decides to enforce, you're kicked out of the market. All right, so equilibrium. In our equilibrium approach, generators are going to base their decisions on a summary set of state values that basically tell them about what electricity prices are going to be in the future, and that will feed into their profits. Their state is going to include their own capacity, heat rate, and adoption status. And then they keep track of what we hope are parsimonious subset of market characteristics. The first is the share of IPP coal capacity that has adopted abatement technology. So if I'm playing against a bunch of rivals who have adopted technology, that looks like they're probably more likely to stay in and I may want to leave. Coal capacity divided by 95th percentile of load. If all my rivals have exited and I'm still sitting here, it might look pretty good for me to stay in. And then the natural gas fuel price relative to coal price. They're going to expect that these variables transition via an AR1 process, well, a whole bunch of AR1 processes. They know that their decisions can affect that adoption share in coal capacity. And that's the key thing here, right? Every generator understands that if it adopts the technology, that technology adoption process will evolve differently than if it doesn't. And that's built in. We're estimating separate AR1 processes in each of those two cases. So equilibrium is then going to be the AR1 regression coefficients that determine those expectations, and then the generator strategies given the structural parameters. So the strategies reflect individual dynamic optimization given those beliefs, and then the data simulated with those strategies yields those same beliefs back. Okay? There's a fixed point there. Okay. And again, for those of you doing the summer school, I'll talk more about the exact implementation of that. We're going to so once we have that, we still need profits. And we're going to recover profits as the sum of hourly profits over the year. Within each year, we're just going to allow generators in every hour to choose to be off, running at minimum, or running at maximum. This is completely out of the literature. This is, a lot of how we think these generators operate. If there's an incentive to produce, there's an incentive to produce up to K. If not, you have to stay at a minimum in order to avoid big shutdown or startup costs. So the state space here is just last hour's generation and some little omega information that affects current and future profits, time of day, weather, all those things that affect whether people need to turn the lights on or the heat on. Well, I guess depending, in Arizona, the heat on. Let P be expected wholesale electricity price, which is a function, of course, of that state. Generator is going to bear O&M costs and ramping costs, and we write down the hourly Bellman. It's a standard Bellman. I asked the other day why we care about discount rates of 0.999, and here I have beta to the 1 over H, so there we go. That's a very close to 1 discount rate. Fortunately, I don't have to solve this Bellman, which would be a giant pain in the neck, and I'll show you why in a little bit. Actually, I'm going to show you why right now. What we're really after here, just to be clear, we don't need to solve for the actions. What we're really after are just these ramping costs and these O&M costs. Those are the two key things we need. So we're going to estimate ramping costs with a trinomial. And the trinomial is, again, showing that I'm not a true reduced form labor person by controlling for continuation value with a whole giant mass of observables. Okay, so what we do is we just put the revenues in, and then we have a ramping cost term, which is basically just a dummy for each choice relative to where you were last period. And then we're putting in a whole bunch of controls X that control for other costs and continuation value. What's going in there are the quantity at the generation level interacted with technology, fuel costs per megawatt, weather, hour of day, month, current load, all those things interacted with the current generation level and time trends. We're just throwing a bunch of stuff at this. So it is one line of Stata code, takes a little while to run. What's the identification here? We need 3 real exclusion restrictions for this to get us good estimates of ramping costs. The first is that revenues don't enter into current period revenues don't enter into continuation values once you've controlled for all that stuff. Right? The second is that lag generation doesn't enter into X, again, conditional on current prices and all this stuff that affects future prices. And then we are assuming price taking. for this estimation. So it's going to be inconsistent, for instance, if we overstate the value from operating at maximum generation when you were off last period instead of at minimum, right? So it's really this correlation between the future and the past conditioning on today's characteristics, this hour's characteristics, that's going to cause us potential problems. The nice thing here is we see hourly electricity prices going forward. And so we can sort of, in its extreme case, we could put in electricity prices into the future as something you know. We don't want to assume perfect information there, so we end up doing it this way, but we can compare the two, right? We can compare whether you make different decisions when prices ended up particularly high versus low. Okay. O&M costs, let me just give you intuition with a simple picture. So on the vertical axis, we have hourly profit per megawatt before O&M. So that's just revenue net of fuel costs. And what we've done is we've said, okay, take every time a generator goes from minimum to maximum generation or back, so ups or downs. For the ups, we're going from left to right. For the downs, we're going from right to left. In the first hour of a 12-hour window around this ramp, what was the hourly profit per megawatt? So thinking about this in terms of a ramp up, this generator's at minimum generation, and it really is not earning that much money per megawatt in that hour. The prices are rising, and that's increasing the value of generating. And we see the generator turn on between hours 6 and 7. And then from hours 7 on, it has our higher profits. This is data, by the way. I didn't make up this picture. This is literally the data. And so we know that right between that 6th and 7th hour, that's when the profits became enough to cover the O&M costs of generating at the higher level. It's the whole intuition of it. So basically, we see that they made this choice in this hour. Ramping costs are netted out here because we're only looking at periods where there were ramps. And we can just tell that the O&M cost must be somewhere in there. Discrete choice model, whatever a 12 nomial, however I call a 12 nomial discrete choice model, tells me what that O&M cost should be. Okay, so dynamic parameters. So once we have that, we've got profits. And now we need to estimate these probabilities, adoption costs, exit scrap value, and the scale parameter. We're going to allow adoption costs to be different for those units subject to state policy and those subject to federal MATS policy. I told you that the policies are sort of enforced differently, and we might be concerned that it's cheaper to comply with the state one. So we're going to allow for heterogeneity there. We used a nested fixed point maximum likelihood estimator. Each generator is in 1 year as an observation, and the likelihood just has this trinomial form, right? It's continue without adopting, adopt, or exit. So how do we estimate this thing? We're going to search over structural parameters, of course, but for each draw or each potential structural parameters vector, we're going to solve for equilibrium by solving all those AR1s, sticking in some AR1s that form the expectation of the evolution of the states, use that to solve for optimal policies, simulate forward data, run the AR1s on that data, use that as the new guess, and continue to convergence. Note here that I can't use a CCP estimator. I think if somebody could come up with a way for me to, it would be interesting. I don't think I can because one of the structural parameters is this p tau, which affects transitions out in the future, right? So I'm sitting in 2013 and there's a structural parameter that doesn't change my action potentially until 2016. That causes problems. Okay, results. These are the ramping results. So each vertical line here is a different regression. We're running this heterogeneous, we're running 5 separate models for different capacities of generators. I'm not showing you the 5th because it sort of kills the scale. But the short thing to think here is that if we look at, say, the 200 megawatt generators, they have a low cost of going from min to max, well, relatively speaking, a higher cost, that green circle, of going from off to on at all. And then to do it all in 1 hour, to go from min to max, is very, very costly, more than the two added up, okay? More than the cost of ramping in 2 hours. These costs are quite large also. So notice we're talking for these large generators, we're talking over $500,000 to go from off to fully on. These are going to matter. These are the coefficient estimates. I guess I can talk more about those later if we want, but the picture tells the story. And given timing, I'm not going to go into model fit, but I'm happy to talk about how that's our identification assumption. This is how the true prices that we observe going forward are related to the actual decisions generators make. Okay, O&M cost estimates come in at about $15 per megawatt, which is right in line with engineering estimates. Engineering estimates are slightly lower, but we would probably expect that because there's something beyond just the engineering costs of running the plant. Okay, so now once we have those things, we can calculate profits, and then we fit this profit surface to the profits so that we know how profits are likely to vary in other states of the world. This looks a lot like what Aaron talked about with the CCP estimators the other day, right? That we're going to spit some surface over a bunch of estimates. In our context, we're going to do this for both profit and pollution because we want to know counterfactual pollution. These things aren't, I'm showing them to you. They more or less seem reasonable, I guess, but they don't need to be like causal exactly. It's not, but they need to capture what's going on in profits and what I should expect to happen with profits when I change the state. Okay. More fun stuff. Oh, that was model fit that I went through very quickly. Well, let's get to the fun stuff. All right, here are probabilities. So in our base specification, we start out in 2012 with probability of basically 1, exactly 1 on this in this table. And then it drops to about 70% in 2013, down to 40% in 2014. That's when the Supreme Court is hearing arguments about the case. And then it comes right back up when the Supreme Court decides, back up to basically 1. Let me talk about that 1 just to start. So what we're assuming here is that the state policies were certain, right? That they are 100% likely to be enforced. But in the first year that they were announced, many of them were not actually certain. It wasn't clear whether the legislature would pass this law. And so I think we have a strong feeling that that 1 is probably somewhat overstated because it's basically just saying that the federal policy was sort of similarly likely to these state policies. In fact, Maryland is a great example. Maryland, the policy only passes because somebody slips the bill under the door of the governor. The governor tries to go hide and say, oh, I didn't get it. And the court decides, no, you did get it because it slipped under your door during business hours. So adoption costs for the states, it's about $150 million to adopt the technology. That jumps to over $500 million for the federal policy for MATS. These are incredibly expensive retrofits to these facilities. Exit scrap value is negative. You pay an exit cost of approximately $200 million to exit this market. And so in the right-hand column, we do a very similar thing, just saying, okay, what if we didn't allow for different adoption costs between state and federal generators? Results are very similar. In particular, the shape of the probabilities over time looks super similar. So that's somewhat reassuring to us. We like our base specification better. We think it fits the setup better. And of course, the log likelihood looks better. All right, so now we have this. Let's do some counterfactuals. So the first 2 columns, the first is just the data. That's the number of generators over time. We fit the data fairly well, we think. It's a little high by the end. We have about a similar number adopting. So now the next thing I'm going to do is say, all right, instead of, next thing I have to do is show you adoption costs and exit costs. Adoption costs we estimate to be about $7.3 billion. Interestingly enough, so this is over 30 years simulating forward. Interestingly, the EPA in their impact statement said that they expected $9.6 billion in compliance costs. And that's you should relate that. They were basically just looking at adoption costs. Now, do I believe $9.6 billion? I don't know. But I'm going to look at Jeff and say he earlier said, a few percentage this way or that way, and who cares because it's structural modeling. We're in the right ballpark, and that makes us feel fairly good about this. All right, the next column, what I'm going to do, I'm going to get rid of that curve, that change over time in the probability. This is just to make my eyeballs happier. Like if I just make it the same average probability over time, I can understand the effect of changing that probability better. When I do that, not all that much changes. But now what I'm going to, so So that column is policies announced in 2012. You wait until 2016 to flip the coin, right? And that coin comes up heads with 78.27% probability, right? That's what that column is. Now I'm going to say, great. Instead, I'm going to announce the policy in 2012 and flip the same coin in 2012. And we're going to know then what's happening, but you still have till 2016 to comply. All right, so what happens? Not shockingly, profits go up. Profits go up by about $930 million. Okay, great. The maybe more shocking thing is pollution goes up. Pollution goes up, as you can see on the bottom panel, because more generators stay in the market. And in particular, if we value that pollution in ways like the EPA would, it can swamp the profit increases. This can make resolving uncertainty early not worth it from a sort of cost-benefit standpoint. Why? I'm glad you asked. Let's think very simply about this. So I'm going to ignore adoption for the moment. Exit is the prime way that you comply with this policy. And let's just imagine I have some CDF of all the shocks that occur between announcement and enforcement. Okay, it's an imaginary thing, but it's not, this is not from data. If I'm to the left of the blue line, I exit, given this 2016 coin flip. If I'm to the right, I remain. And I get this probability of exit as the blue dotted line. Great. Now I'm going to flip the coin early. If I flip the coin early and it says enforce, that blue line shifts to the right, becomes the red line on the right. 80% likely for that to happen, so we don't move very far. If I flip the coin and it comes up don't enforce, we move to the left. Many more generators stay in the market. Kind of makes sense. All right. And then I'm going to take the expected value over that thing. And so I just get Jensen's inequality, right? It's pretty simple. So because I know that fewer generators exited the market, that's telling me I'm on the concave portion of this curve. And that makes a lot of sense because we know that this economic conditions for these generators were pretty crappy during this period. And so they must be over to the right where they're very likely to exit. But that tells us also that if we had been over to the left, if the generators had been more likely to stay in the market, then resolving uncertainty earlier would have increased exit and reduced pollution. So this is kind of interesting, right? It's saying that that early resolution of uncertainty attenuates extreme outcomes. It pulls you towards the middle with like something that you learned first year of grad school, if not earlier, right? Okay. Finally, if I just say no exit costs, I just literally pay all of the remediation, site remediation costs, all that stuff that generators have to pay when they exit. It's a massive transfer from the government to the generators. You know, profits go up from 48 billion to like 70 billion. Huge transfer. You get more exit, but not a ton, actually. You know, so you go from 130 approximately generators left in the market to about 110. So it's actually interesting how much exit occurred because of this policy, or in this period at least, and how much more money you'd have to pay to get more exit. Okay, so concluding, what do we do here? We estimate the extent and impact of policy uncertainty for MATS. So we're recovering these literal expected probabilities between 2012 and 2015 that the policy would actually be enacted and enforced in 2016. To do that, we develop a dynamic oligopoly framework and estimate adoption and exit. And we're going to provide new approaches to estimating ramping and O&M costs. We find that there was a lot of uncertainty surrounding enforcement especially in 2013 and 14. In 2014, that probability is like 0.45. Total maximal uncertainty is 0.5, right? If it was 0, you'd know for sure it wasn't going to be enforced. So it was really uncertain when the Supreme Court was hearing it. But eliminating that uncertainty increases generator expected profits, as we would expect. You can better time your decisions and you get, you know, a good exit shock, something like that, you can leave. But it also increases pollution for exactly that sort of Jensen's inequality story. It's basically pulling you towards the middle. And in this particular situation, plants were very likely to exit. Subsidizing exit costs would cause more generator exit than MATS, but not a ton more. So we do expect that resolving policy uncertainty early is going to allow firms to make better decisions and increase profits. We think that's a general result. In this case, it also leads to more pollution. And we think this is sort of an interesting thing to think about in these discussions about how much power the EPA should or shouldn't have. There was a big Supreme Court case over this earlier in 2022. In general, that reduced the EPA's ability to make sort of big decisions. We see that's going to have different effects depending on where you sort of are in firm's choice CDF. So thank you.
We have 4.5 minutes to ask questions.
Oh, I could have just kept talking. Ariel.
The fact that I reduced uncertainty or I realized it earlier on means that I'm principle can do better because I will stop errors. I know things earlier on.
Yes.
So the state could also change policy when it realized, because you now know what will be the outcome of the policy.
Yeah.
So if you brought it forward, it's not clear the state should keep to the same policy.
The only state that would affect is Wisconsin. So the other states all had enforcement before the announcement of the EPA policy. So Wisconsin had announced before then, but hadn't yet enforced.
You're saying state Wisconsin.
Yeah, sorry. So in the paper, we were really careful about US state versus like estimation state.
So you're saying that Wisconsin was the only place
that was still making decisions. Wisconsin was the only state that still had not yet enforced its policy by the time the federal government announced its policy.
Well, here's what I
Yeah.
I thought you just showed us that the costs of adapting to the government policy, to the federal policy, were much larger than the costs of adapting to the state policy.
Yeah, so this is something I didn't cover precisely well enough. If you are in Connecticut or Wisconsin or one of these states with a state policy, we are assuming you don't need to make additional investments for the federal policy. I don't know precisely whether that's true or not, but.
You gave us numbers that had a different number for, for where does that come? You haven't gave us numbers that said this
Yeah.
is what it is for the state, and then there's this additional what it is for the.
We're going way back. Oh, there it was.
I'll keep going. I didn't know.
Yeah, it's coming from this, right? So it's coming from, and what I'm not showing, this is just raw data, but what I'm not showing you is like what gas prices were, expected profits were, or anything like that in these periods. But in these periods, even once we control for gas prices and all that, we see that those generators subject to US state policies are much more likely to adopt than exit, whereas those subject to MATs are much more likely to exit than adopt. And that looks in the likelihood like there's an additional cost of adoption even after we control for the fact that gas prices were way lower in this period and all that stuff. Yeah.
Could you use this model to predict how long until the US becomes coal-free?
I would love to, except what I would really need there is generator age, and the data's cruddy. We tried, we wanted it in here, right? We wanted to see whether the older generators were more likely to choose exit than adoption. The data are very noisy, and so we didn't trust it. We may ask some contacts at the EPA if they have better numbers, but yes, I mean, in theory, at least, it could just become another state of the model, and then you can interact it with exit cost or adoption cost or whatever you want, and then they could be more likely to choose exit. Yeah, but as of right now, once MATS happens, the ones that stay in there, the only reason they exit is if like gas prices fall even further or something like that. There's no age, there's no deterioration. Yeah. Good, okay, thank you all.